Do you want to teach your kids financial literacy, like how to budget, invest, and save? Have you wondered where to find the best resources for money management? Is there an appropriate age to begin educating your kids on how money works? And if so, when and how do you start? My guest will give us the answers to these and many other questions in just a moment, so don't go away.
Welcome to the Fatherhood Challenge, a movement to awaken and inspire fathers everywhere to take great pride in their role and to challenge society to understand how important fathers are to the stability and culture of their family's environment. Now, here's your host, Jonathan Guerrero.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My guest is Antoine Johnson. Antoine is a speaker, coach, helping men and fathers heal from the emotional pain and trauma caused by the absence of their fathers so they can grow into effective and nurturing caregivers. He's also the founder of Grace Johnson Enterprises LLC, a company that inspires Christian couples to begin to be aligned financially, to find peace with their money and relationships by managing their money wisely. Antoine, thank you so much for being on the Fatherhood Challenge.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
Antoine, I got to know, what is your favorite dad joke?
Good question. Here's my favorite dad joke that I heard. Gentleman says, what do you call a fake noodle?
What do you call a fake noodle? I'm not sure.
An impasta.
That is great. All right. So, Antoine, let's start off with our first question. You didn't have a father around to teach you money skills, life skills, or who God is. What is your story?
My story early on, my mother had me at about the age of 17. And, actually during that time, she was told to have an abortion, but instead she decided to have me. And, part of my story is I really believe that me and everyone else, that we're really called and created for a purpose, with a purpose. And a lot of what I do today, working with fathers, is a part of that. So my father, unfortunately, was young and didn't have a father in his life. And so consequently, he learned some negative habits or behaviors along the way. And so he was often verbally and physically abusive toward my mother. And so, there was a point where I really I idolized, or we'll go with that word, idolize him. But then I also resented or despised the way that he interacted with my mother. And so I had my father in my life in and off. He was in and out of my life until about the age of 13. And around the age of 13, he actually was diagnosed with a mental health disorder known as schizophrenia. And so at that point, I didn't have much of a relationship with him at all, because he was then institutionalized. And so I really was blessed to meet some good mentors in my church around the age of 17. And they took me under their wing and showed me things as it related to manhood and also spirituality, right? So that's where I really began to fortify my faith in Christ, and consequently go on to do some other things, good things, finish college and marry my wife at the age of 24. And then the rest is kind of history. We have 2 children now and are trying to create a new legacy of our own.
How does fatherlessness impact children financially? How does it also impact their ability to manage money when they become an adult?
Yeah, that's another great question. So studies actually show that families or children who grow up in households without their biological father or father figure are 4 times greater risk of living in poverty, right? So there's the great big statistic or barrier right there. But then when we talk about managing money, so at the times when I was around my father growing up, he was like a workaholic, right? He was a workaholic. He liked buying himself nice things and things of that nature. And so I saw what it was like to spend money, right? Like my parents would take me shopping and so forth. And I saw what it was like to spend money, but I didn't really understand the concept of saving money. And so in my coaching practice, we have this thing that I'll bring up sometime, are you a natural spender or are you a natural saver? And growing up, I was certainly a natural spender. And so I had to learn how to develop saving habits. So similarly, I think that translates into how parents, fathers, moms, whomever, and raising their children, knowing what their tendencies are, and helping their children to build on the things that either they do well or are trying to grow into, right? So for me, one of the things that I will be teaching my daughter, she's 3 now, so that some certain things she doesn't understand. But one of the things that I'm really keen on is the idea of work and responsibility, right? Like as it relates to earning money, because I think that a lot of times, especially when kids are young, they have this idea that money kind of just grows off trees. And so having
Mm-hmm.
little ones understand that, well, when you do X, Y, and Z, then this is where money comes from, right? Obviously, they're not working a job per se, but when you give them little tasks and stuff to do, then yeah, I think sometimes it's appropriate to give them money so that they can see the correlation, right? If I do this, I get that.
So, what does faith in God have to do with wise money management, and how does a dad link them when educating their children?
I don't know how many times it shows up, but the Bible actually talks a lot about money. If you look in the book of Proverbs alone, there are a lot of things as it relates to money. In fact, one of my favorite passages in the book of Proverbs says, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall your poverty come, right? And so that verse kind of encapsulates this idea of having a strong work ethic, because if you don't, then you are at greater risk of being without, living in poverty, right? So aside from that, I mean, scripture talks a lot about money management. I think it's just really being able to like sift through and understand or pull out those concepts and so forth.
When I listen to that scripture you just referenced, one of the things that popped in my mind, and tell me if this is accurate, but really when it comes to habits and things like that, the road to poverty is a gradual thing. So it I don't picture that just happening overnight. Is that
Yeah.
a fair assessment for how that happens?
You know what? I think that's a loaded question, because I think that, there are some instances where you have families that have lived in generation of poverty, right? Their families didn't have much, and then sometimes their mentalities and habits and behaviors that translates over into the next generation. So I guess that kind of goes along with what you said in terms of it doesn't just happen. It doesn't just happen for some folks. I think that other times people fall into just really bad situations, right? And they can end up there. But I think there's a lot of reasons why that happens. Seldomly does anything just happen, though, right? There are reasons for why that happens. Studies actually show, ironically enough, that when folks are not married, right? They enter relationships and they have children and do things before getting married, that they're more susceptible to ending up in poverty. Whereas when they get married, if they get married, the chances of them living in poverty are like less than 10%. And that has nothing to do with Christianity or so forth, as much as it just has to do with quality of life and two incomes and all the other things that come when folks come together and are able to go through life together.
The generational component of it is really interesting to me because when you have generations of poverty, how do you teach your kids prosperity?
Part of it is learning something new, right? Right, getting outside of your natural environment or what you're comfortable with. That's been one of the things that's helped my family. I come from a family where not just my parents didn't go to college, and I mean, not that that's the standard or gold standard for success, but there's that, and I have other family who are not necessarily millionaires, right? And so I think some of it is has to do with getting outside of what you know or are familiar with and learning something new. I recently listened to a radio show or podcast, and it's like, you know what, you want to become successful, why don't you take a millionaire out to lunch, right? Yeah, you probably saying you can't afford it, but take them out to lunch and ask them questions, right? Buy them the appetizer, the dinner, the dessert, and just soak up that time to learn from them. And I think a lot of what I'm talking about now has to do with just learning from people who are doing things well and who have, kind of crossed that barrier related to financial challenges or so forth. There's a book known as called The Proximity Principle by Ken Coleman. And he talks about this concept. He has like three or four principles around, just being in the right place, around the right people, in the right environments that are conducive to going where you want to go. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with finances, but it can deal with financial related things, but it can translate to almost any area of life, right? When we want to learn something new or grow in a different area, it is getting into the environments around the people and soaking up as much as we possibly can.
What other books do you think are great books to read to learn some of these really good principles?
The other book that I was actually thinking of prior to coming on is called Smart Money, Smart Kids by Dave Ramsey and Rachel Cruz. That was one of the books that really opened my eyes around how parents can effectively teach their children money management or financial literacy principles and skills. I actually read that book probably about 2 or 3 years prior to having my daughter, who's 3 now.
What is the best age to begin teaching your kids financial literacy, and how should that process begin?
I don't know that I would give a best age. I think every parent knows their child, right? Some kids progress faster than others, and they understand things or pick up things faster than others. And I think just kind of knowing when it began to introduce things, right? So for me, I mentioned that I'm not really going super heavy with my 3-year-old right now, but I'm teaching her about like responsibility, picking up after herself and things of that nature, right? So shortly, in a short while, we'll be talking about, okay, if you do these couple things, then you can earn, a set amount of dollars, right? So in Smart Money, Smart Kids, one of the things that they talk about is having like an allotment of money, right? That parents will put aside. So my wife and I do a monthly budget every month. We have been for the last 5 years, right? So in our monthly budget, one of the things, line items that we might include is not an allowance, but it is a commission, right, for our daughter. So we may put $20 for the month in there. And so she could earn up to a commission of $20 that month by doing various tasks. Again, this is a 3-year-old we're talking about, so it's it's going to vary. But again, so that I'm not getting far away from your question, I think that parents have to kind of gauge and feel for like what their children can understand around introducing financial principles or ideas. So that's one of the other things that I took away from Smart Money, Smart Kids is they don't necessarily adopt the allowance mindset, and I think what they allude to in there is that it helps to further cultivate this entitlement mentality. Whereas, like, if I have an allowance set aside for you, you're going to get it regardless of what you do or do not do. Whereas if I have a line item for commission dollars to be earned, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you don't get X amount of dollars. If you only do $10 worth of work, you're only going to get $10 regardless of the fact that there's 20 available to you, right? Maybe they might roll over to the next month, but that's up to the parents, right? And I think that it helps perpetuate this idea of, well, okay, if I go out and hunt, kill something, bring it back home, I get to eat it. But if I don't find anything, then I'm not, eating. And again, these are children. We don't want to be super legalistic about it, but the idea is that we're teaching them things that they're going to learn now for when they get older in life, and they don't feel like someone owes them anything, right? They have a very strong work ethic and understand, that working equals or producing things equals a harvest, right? Something to be gained.
So let's talk about charitable giving. So giving and being generous with your money. How do you teach that to your kids?
So I'll start back from when I was a kid. So I mentioned that I'm a natural spender, had to learn how to save. One of the things that I caught, and Rachel Cruz says this, I love this quote, she says, more is caught than taught. one of the things that I caught from my mother was generosity. And so over the years, the decades of witnessing her just generously, freely give to folks, whether it's like at stores, or maybe she saw someone in the grocery line. She's like, I want to help pay for your groceries, or church or whatever. Like, I just always saw her at different touch points giving. And so I say that to say that when we think about helping our kids to cultivate a heart of generosity or giving, that they have to see that, right? They have to see it being done by us. And then on the tactical, more practical side, then, intentionally putting in a line item for giving, and it can be to local church, nonprofit, wherever, right? Wherever you feel led to give, and then being able to execute on that and actually do it, right? But yeah, that's more or less how, what I've seen and what my wife and I do. And I think we have to be more intentional than ever of creating those opportunities. Nowadays, we live in a very digital, debit card, whatever society, the credit cards, whatever. And so it's not as tangible, right? Like, you don't see those dollars all the time going out into the collection plate at church, or giving them to someone per se, right? Because now we got the cash out, we got this and that. And so I think we have to be more intentional than ever to help them see when we're being generous toward other people.
I definitely believe in modeling the behavior of giving, but I've literally sat and watched a panhandler get up and walk quite a ways into a very nice vehicle, and then and then whip out their electronic devices and then drive off.
Yeah.
And we've seen that. So that really sours the attitude of giving, of being generous. And so, but by the same token, I've seen families, literally families on a street corner, begging,
Yeah.
and it looks legit. And that made me really have to wrestle with, what are my principles on giving? What do I really believe? What do I do with these situations? There are the obvious ones where I feel like I would not be a good steward of my money if I parted with my money with a guy who's literally going to get up and go get in his Cadillac that you can actually see him going towards and
Right.
driving off. That is a waste of money and poor stewardship in my mind. But there's some that you really just don't know.
Yeah.
And there's this burning principle in my mind that Jesus taught, where if you do something, do as if you're doing it to me. And there's this whole thing of, at some point when you get to meet Jesus, and he asks you, or he tells you, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. And so by that, he knows you. He recognizes you. If you did not do these things, then he won't know you. So there's this principle. So I am near a street corner, and there's a guy that looks homeless, or a family that looks homeless, and I'm not really sure. So what I went with was, and I had this talk with my son, and I explained to him that God knows what's in your heart.
Yeah.
Do what's in your heart. And so whatever is going on between that individual that you're giving to and God is between them and God. At some point, they will have to answer
Yeah.
for whatever it is that they're doing. Maybe they are in that situation. In that case, you bless them. And
Yeah.
God may have used you to be a blessing to that person. And that's a beautiful experience when that can happen. If that person is not legit, there is a price to be paid, and that is between them and God. And that does not concern you. That's the principle I taught to my son. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I love that. So, and as you were talking, I was just thinking about, there had been times where, and I also struggle with that. Sometimes my wife is like, you're a little bit too much, right? Because there is scripture that talks about, well, man doesn't work, man shouldn't eat, right? And so, and so when I see able-bodied individuals out in the community, and sometimes able-bodied is relative, right? Because if someone is struggling with a mental health issue or even an addiction problem, then they're not of sound mind, right? Then there's some nuances to that. But I struggle with similar to you, right? Like just when folks are able to, but they refuse not to because there's a so-called easier way. Um, I have had experiences though where the Holy Spirit really just weighed heavy on my heart about giving, and I knew I should give,
Hmm.
right? And there have been other times where I'm like going back and forth, like, should I do this? Should I not? And so, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And but I completely understand and can relate to what you're talking about. I think the on the other side too, right? There's a practical side of setting boundaries, right? So we have been in a season, my wife and I, where we are really trying to pay off some debt and do some things. So we had a line item for church for giving, but then we didn't have much else for anything else. And so our ability to give in that particular season was really limited. But our boundaries, our cutoff was pretty much the church. Now there had been a little situation where somebody needed a $5 or a couple of dollars. That's a little different. That's pocket money. That's different. But having boundaries, I think, is so important because similar to the situation I described with my mother, she has what's known as a bleeding heart, right? And my wife has it too, and so they're like wanting to give. They'll give it all away. There's no boundaries. And so my thing is also knowing what you can do, because sometimes we'll give to where we're lacking, right? And so now we're struggling. Oh, I don't know how I'm going to pay a light bill because I gave that money away. So unless the Lord has designated you to give that money away, then you need boundaries.
Let's take a slightly different direction. So, when you're trying to teach money management to your kids, do you avoid plastic and stick with cash?
Well, in today's society, I think we have to kind of get along with the times, and so I think that there's a way to teach money management skills, principles when using plastic too, right? So we have an app actually through Ramsey Solutions called Every Dollar. So we do every dollar in our app, but then we also have like an Excel spreadsheet thing, right? So maybe around the age of 4 or 5, we might start bringing our daughter over when we have what we call budget committee meetings. And so I think there's ways to still show your children and help them even apart from using cash, right? Because we just live in a different time now. Another simple concept, and also I took this from Smart Money, Smart Kids too, is the three prongs of save, give, spend, right? So we talked about generosity, we talked about saving, talk about spending money. We're gonna spend money, right? Like that's a given, right? So there's a
Hmm.
percentage of the money that we spend, maybe 60, 70%, I don't know. Maybe with another percent of that, we're saving, right? Like in a lot of intentionality around saving. And then there's another percent where we're giving. That doesn't necessarily have to be church, but if it is, great. And so whether or not the kids are on a commission or an allowance doesn't really matter. If they have $5, you can teach them to, hey, you can spend three, you can give one, and you can save one, right? So always kind of, and you're helping them build their muscles, right? Like, so for those who work out at the gym, right, like there are ways of, training the body, and the body continues to build and build and build and so forth. So you're essentially helping your kids to, hey, listen, this is how you build saving habits. This is how you build being generous, right? And starting early with those three things, save, give, spend, can be helpful.
Early on, we talked about resources such as books, resources to be able to learn and develop financial literacy. What are some other resources that dads should use to educate their kids about good money management?
I was actually just recently talking to a colleague of mine about a book known as The Richest Man in Babylon. I forget who the author is right now, but that book is really good in terms of also like driving home the importance of working, and how work is good and honorable. In terms of other tools that dads can use to help teach their kids, maybe they can employ some of the the cookie jar, right, or the little mason jars around, like the kids putting in money, right, to save, give, or spend, or what have you. I mean, I think it kind of like whatever works for your household, and just being creative with it. I think the other thing that I want to say, as we began to wind things down and so forth, is for parents not to be super, again, legalistic and strict about it, because I think that could be a huge turnoff if it's not kind of enjoyable to learn, right? Like, kids need an environment where they can make mistakes. My wife and I make mistakes with money sometimes. And they need to know that, listen, I'm going to do some things that are not necessarily right all the time, but hey, listen, Dad's going to help me he's going to help guide me and be the safety net when I need, right? Not enable them, but helping to imploring them to move forward in a way that they can enjoy learning about money in their early years.
How can dads connect with you to learn more about what you're doing, or get some coaching, or even find resources on teaching financial literacy to their kids?
Yeah. So our agency, the Buffalo Prenatal Perinatal Network, is our parent agency. That's www.bppn.org. And on our page, you'll find the Buffalo Fatherhood Initiative program. Folks can also email me at ajohnson@bppn.org in order to connect with me. And we also have a social media. So again, if you go to Buffalo Prenatal, you'll find our Facebook page, and we have a podcast also. So it's called the Buffalo Fatherhood Initiative Podcast, and you can find that on YouTube.
I'm going to put all of these resources on the Fatherhood Challenge website. So if you go to thefatherhoodchallenge.com, that's thefatherhoodchallenge.com, and you go to this episode, look below the description. All of the links that we've talked about that Antoine just mentioned, all of the reference links will all be below that description. So Antoine, as we close, what is your challenge to dads listening now?
Yeah, my challenge to you all is to continue to be transparent and vulnerable about who you are as dad, and being able to say sorry when you make mistakes, and giving your kids the nurturance and guidance that they need, whether you're teaching them about money or just life in general, right? I think a lot of times those dads will come off as really stoic and stern and maybe even unapproachable at times, but I think just really being open and showing that our children that we are safe place.
All right. Well, Antoine, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. I have learned a lot, and I know our audience did too. So thank you so much for being on the Fatherhood Challenge.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatherhood Challenge. If you would like to contact us, listen to other episodes, find any resource mentioned in this program, or find out more information about the Fatherhood Challenge, please visit thefatherhoodchallenge.com. That's thefatherhoodchallenge.com.